The year was 1874, and the merciless drought had claimed everything. Cattle lay scattered across the parched earth like broken dreams, their bones bleaching white under the relentless sun. When the bank notice arrived that cold October morning, Evangeline Hartwell knew she had exactly 30 days before losing the ranch. That had been her sanctuary and her prison for the past 3 years. At 32, she had already buried a husband and watched her hopes crumble like dust in the wind. What she didn't know was that salvation would come in the form of a 12-year-old boy, with determined eyes and calloused hands, carrying nothing but a worn leather satchel and a story that would change everything. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of the Wyoming Territory like a shroud, and Evangeline could feel the weight of another sleepless night pressing down on her shoulders. She stood on the porch of her weathered ranch house, watching the sun slowly paint the sky in shades of amber and gold. The silence was deafening. No lowing of cattle, no neighing of horses, just the whisper of wind through the dry grass. Her husband Thomas had built this place with his own 2 hands, dreaming of a cattle empire that would stretch from horizon to horizon. Those dreams had died with him when his horse threw him during a spring roundup, leaving Evangeline to face the harsh realities of frontier life alone. The ranch that had once been home to over 300 head of cattle now stood empty, save for the 2 old mares in the barn and a handful of chickens that scratched hopefully in the dirt. Evangeline wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and walked to the edge of the porch. The wooden planks creaked under her feet, a sound that had once been comforting, but now seemed to echo the emptiness that had settled into every corner of her life. She had tried everything, selling what cattle survived the drought, taking in washing from the nearby town of Millbrook, even attempting to grow vegetables in the unforgiving soil. Nothing had been enough to keep the wolves from her door. The letter from the bank sat on her kitchen table like a coiled rattlesnake. Its words burned into her memory. 30 days to settle outstanding debts or face foreclosure proceedings. She had read it so many times that the paper was soft and worn from her trembling fingers. 27 days remained, and she had no more ideas, no more strength to fight what seemed inevitable. A movement in the distance caught her eye, and she squinted against the morning sun. A small figure was walking up the dusty road that led to her ranch, moving with a determined stride that seemed purposeful for a casual traveler. As the figure drew closer, Evangeline could make out the shape of a child, a boy, she realized. With sandy hair and clothes that had seen better days, the boy approached her gate and stopped, looking up at her with eyes that held far too much knowledge for someone so young. His face was smudged with dirt and fatigue, but there was something in his expression that reminded Evangeline of her late husband, a stubborn resilience that refused to be broken. "Ma'am," the boy called out, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. "I'm looking for work. Heard tell you might have need of a hand." Evangeline almost laughed, but the sound died in her throat. Work? She could barely afford to feed herself, let alone hire help. But something about the boy's earnest expression made her pause. She stepped down from the porch and walked toward the gate, her boots crunching on the dry grass. "What's your name, son?" she asked, studying his face more carefully. He couldn't be more than 12 or 13, but there was an old soul looking back at her through those clear blue eyes. "Jeremiah Thornton." "Ma'am, most folks call me Jeb." He shifted the worn leather satchel on his shoulder and straightened his shoulders. "I can work hard, and I don't eat much. I know cattle and horses, and I can fix near anything that's broken." Evangeline felt a familiar ache in her chest. The boy reminded her of the children she and Thomas had dreamed of having, the ones who would have filled this ranch with laughter and given their lives meaning, beyond the daily struggle for survival. But those dreams had died along with everything else. "I'm sorry, Jeb," she said softly. "I don't have work for anyone. Truth is, I don't even have a ranch anymore. Come another month, and this place will belong to the bank." She expected him to turn around and walk away, but instead, Jeb pushed open the gate and stepped into her yard. His eyes swept over the empty corrals, the silent barn, and the house that looked as tired as she felt. "Looks like you got plenty of work to me," he said matter-of-factly. "Just 'cause you don't have cattle don't mean there ain't things that need doing." Evangeline stared at him, unsure whether to be amused or exasperated by his persistence. "You don't understand, boy. I don't have money to pay you." "I don't have money for anything." Jeb shrugged and set his satchel down on the ground. "Didn't ask for money, asked for work. There's a difference." Before Evangeline could respond, the boy had rolled up his sleeves and was examining the broken hinge on her gate. He pulled a small tool from his pocket and began working on it with the practiced ease of someone who had been fixing things his whole life. "Where are your parents, Jeb?" Evangeline asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Dead," he said simply, not looking up from his work. "Cholera took them both last spring. Been on my own since then, doing what I can to get by." The words hit Evangeline like a physical blow. Here was a boy who had lost everything, just as she had. Yet he stood before her offering to work for nothing more than the chance to be useful. She watched him work on the gate, his small hands moving with surprising skill, and felt something stir in her chest that she hadn't felt in months. Hope. "Why here?" she asked. "Why my ranch?" Jeb looked up at her then, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. "My pa used to tell me stories about the frontier, about folks who built something from nothing with their own two hands. Said it didn't matter how hard the ground was or how fierce the wind blew. If you had the will to keep fighting, you could make a life anywhere." He returned to his work on the gate, figured maybe we could help each other. Evangeline stood there for a long moment, watching this orphan boy work with quiet determination. She thought about the empty house behind her, the silence that had become her constant companion, and the letter from the bank that promised to take away the last thing she had left of Thomas. "I can't pay you," she said again, but her voice lacked conviction. "Already told you that don't matter," Jeb replied, testing the gate. It swung smoothly on its hinges for the first time in months. "There, that's better." Evangeline felt tears prick at her eyes. Such a small thing, but it was the first repair that had been made to the ranch in longer than she cared to remember. "You hungry?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jeb's face lit up with the first genuine smile she had seen from him. "Yes, ma'am, I surely am," as they walked toward the house together. Evangeline felt the weight on her shoulders shift slightly. She still had 27 days before the bank came calling, and she still had no idea how she was going to save her ranch. But for the first time in months, she didn't feel completely alone. The kitchen was warm and filled with the smell of biscuits and bacon. As Evangeline prepared breakfast for two, it had been so long since she had cooked for anyone else that she had almost forgotten the simple pleasure of setting the plates on the table instead of one. Jeb sat quietly, his hair damp from the wash she had insisted he take at the pump outside. "Tell me about your folks," Evangeline said as she served the food. "What did your father do?" Jeb's face grew solemn, but he didn't shy away from the question. "He was a blacksmith in a town called Cedar Falls, about 2 days' ride north of here. Ma took in sewing to help make ends meet. They were good people, worked hard for everything they had, and after they died, tried to keep the smithy going. But I was too young and too small. Town folks meant well, but they all had their own troubles. Finally had to sell what I could and move on." He took a bite of biscuit and chewed thoughtfully. "Been walking ever since, doing odd jobs. Sleeping under the stars ain't so bad, really. You learn to make do." Evangeline studied his face, seeing the careful way he chose his words. This boy had grown up fast, probably faster than any child should have to. She recognized the look. She had seen it in her own mirror often enough. "What made you think I might need help?" she asked. Jeb looked up from his plate, his blue eyes steady and serious. "Heard talk in Millbrook yesterday. Folks saying the widow Hartwell was in a bad way, probably going to lose her ranch. Figured anyone in that much trouble might be willing to take a chance on someone like me." The honesty in his voice was both refreshing and heartbreaking. Evangeline set down her fork and really looked at him, this thin, determined boy who had walked into her life offering to work for nothing more than the chance to belong somewhere. "What do you know about ranching?" she asked. "Plenty. Pa may have been a blacksmith, but his brother ran cattle up in Montana Territory. Spent summers there learning the trade. I can ride, rope, brand, and doctor sick animals. I know which grass is good for grazing and how to read weather signs. I may be small, but I'm stronger than I look." Evangeline nodded slowly. Even if she could somehow save the ranch, she would need help rebuilding. The question was whether she had the right to drag this boy into her troubles. "Jeb," she said carefully, "I need you to understand something. This ranch is 27 days away from being taken by the bank. I owe more money than I can possibly pay, and I don't have cattle to sell or crops to harvest. If you stay here, you might be putting yourself in the same position I'm in, with nothing." Jeb finished chewing and swallowed before answering. "Ma'am, I've had nothing for near 6 months now. Least here I'd have nothing with a roof over my head and someone to share it with." The simple truth of his words hit Evangeline harder than any elaborate speech could have. She had been so focused on what she was losing that she had forgotten what she still had, a home, however temporary, and the possibility of companionship. In her darkest hour, "All right," she said finally, "you can stay. But I want you to understand that if things go bad, you need to be ready to move on. I won't have you trapped here because of my problems." Jeb's face broke into a grin that transformed his entire appearance. "Thank you, ma'am. You won't regret it. I promise." After breakfast, Jeb insisted on exploring the ranch to get a full picture of what needed to be done. Evangeline watched from the porch as he moved through the empty corrals, examining fence, posts and gates with the practiced eye of someone who understood the importance of good maintenance. "This is good grazing land," he called out, running his hand along a fence rail. "Soil's rich. Even if it's dry right now, come spring, this grass will be thick and green." Evangeline felt a pang of sadness. Spring seemed like a lifetime away, and she wouldn't be here to see it. But she said nothing. Not wanting to dampen the boy's enthusiasm, Jeb made his way to the barn, disappearing inside for several minutes, before emerging with a thoughtful expression. "You've got two good mares in there," he said. "They're in decent shape, considering. And there's plenty of good hay still stored in the loft." "The hay won't last through winter," Evangeline replied. "I sold most of it to pay for supplies." "Maybe not," Jeb said, "but it's a start, and there's something else." He walked back toward her, his eyes bright with possibility. "That smithy equipment in the corner of the barn, it's good quality. Hammer, anvil, bellows, the works." "Does it work?" Evangeline blinked in surprise. I don't know. Thomas bought it from a traveling merchant years ago. Said he wanted to learn to do his own horseshoeing. Never got around to it." Jeb's grin widened. "Well, I know how to use it. And I bet there's folks in Millbrook who'd pay good money for metalwork. Horseshoes, nails, tool repair, that sort of thing." For the first time in months, Evangeline felt a flicker of genuine hope. "You really think so?" "I know so. Pa taught me everything he knew about working iron. It's hard work, but it pays well, and there's always a need for it." Jeb paused, looking at her with an expression that was both hopeful and hesitant. "Course, I'd need help getting started. Someone to help with the bellows, maybe take orders in town. But if we could get it going, we could make enough to at least pay something toward the debt." Evangeline finished, her mind racing with possibilities. "Maybe more than something," Jeb said. "If we work hard and get lucky, we might make enough to save this place." That afternoon, they cleaned out the smithy corner of the barn, working side by side in companionable silence. The equipment was in better shape than Evangeline had expected, though it would need some repairs before it could be used regularly. Jeb examined each piece with the careful attention of an expert, explaining to Evangeline how each tool was used and what needed to be fixed. "The bellows needs new leather," he said, running his hands along the cracked surface, "and we'll need to stock up on iron stock. But the anvil's solid, and the forge just needs a good cleaning." As they worked, Evangeline found herself watching the boy with growing amazement. Despite his youth, he moved with the confidence of someone who had been working with his hands his entire life. More than that, he seemed to genuinely enjoy the work, humming quietly as he sorted through the tools. "You really think we can make this work?" she asked as they took a break to drink water from the well. Jeb considered the question seriously. "Won't be easy," he said finally, "and we'll need to start right away if we want to have any chance of raising the money in time. But yes, I think we can do it." That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the empty rangeland, Evangeline felt something she hadn't experienced in months, a sense of purpose. For the first time since Thomas's death, she had a plan, a goal to work toward. That didn't involve simply surviving from one day to the next. "Jeb," she said quietly, "I want you to know that whatever happens, I'm grateful you came here. You've given me something I'd forgotten I had." "What's that, ma'am, Hope?" The boy smiled, and for a moment, Evangeline could almost forget about the letter from the bank and the impossible task ahead of them. Almost. The next morning brought their first real test. Jeb had gotten the forge working and was heating metal. For their first project, a set of horseshoes that Evangeline had commissioned from the stable owner in Millbrook. The work was hot, difficult, and required perfect timing between the two of them. "Now," Jeb called out, and Evangeline pumped the bellows with all her strength, sending a blast of air through the coals that made them glow white-hot. Sweat poured down both their faces as they worked, but gradually, the shapeless piece of iron began to take the familiar curve of a horseshoe. "That's it," Jeb exclaimed, plunging the finished shoe into a bucket of water. The metal hissed and steamed, and when he pulled it out, Evangeline could see that it was perfectly formed. "One down," she said, wiping sweat from her forehead. "3 to go." By midday, they had completed the order and were ready to make their first trip to town. Evangeline hitched up one of the mares to the wagon while Jeb carefully packed their finished work. As they set off down the dusty road, Evangeline felt a mix of nervousness and excitement that reminded her of her first day of school. Millbrook was a small town, but it was growing as more settlers moved into the territory. The main street was lined with businesses, a general store, a saloon, a hotel, and the stable where they were to deliver their horseshoes. People nodded politely as they passed, though Evangeline could see the curiosity in their eyes. She had rarely come to town since Thomas's death, and certainly never with a young boy in tow. The stable owner, a gruff man named Morton, examined their work with a critical eye. Evangeline held her breath as he turned each horseshoe over in his hands, testing the weight and checking the shape. "Good work," he said finally, and Evangeline nearly sagged with relief. "Clean lines, proper balance. You looking to take on more orders?" "Yes, sir," Jeb replied quickly. "We can handle most any metalwork you might need." Morton nodded approvingly. "I'll keep that in mind. There's always need for quality smithing in a growing town." As they walked back to the wagon, pockets heavier, with their first earned money, Evangeline felt a surge of pride. It wasn't much, barely enough to buy supplies for the next week, but it was a start. More importantly, it proved that Jeb's plan could work. "Where to next?" she asked as they climbed onto the wagon seat. "General store," Jeb replied. "We need to let folks know we're in business, and maybe pick up some supplies for the next batch of work." The general store was bustling with activity, and Evangeline felt self-conscious as they entered. She had been in here many times before, but always as a customer buying necessities with dwindling funds. Now she was here as a businesswoman, and the difference felt significant. The store owner, Mr. Patterson, greeted them warmly. "Mrs. Hartwell, good to see you in town. And who's this young man?" "This is Jeb Thornton," Evangeline replied. "He's helping me with some work around the ranch." "Pleased to meet you, son." Patterson extended his hand, which Jeb shook firmly. "What kind of work are you folks doing?" Jeb straightened his shoulders. "Smithing, sir. General metalwork, tool repair, horseshoeing, anything folks might need." Patterson's eyebrows rose in interest. "Is that so? Well, I'll tell you what. I've got a pile of tools in the back that need attention. Shovels with loose handles, pickaxes that need sharpening, that sort of thing. You think you could handle that kind of work?" "Yes, sir," Jeb replied confidently. "We surely can." By the time they left the store, they had 3 more orders and a growing list of potential customers. Word was spreading that there was a new smithy operating out of the Hartwell Ranch, and people were curious to see what they could do. The days that followed fell into a rhythm of hard work and gradual progress. They would rise before dawn to get the forge going, work through the morning on whatever orders they had, then spend the afternoon making repairs around the ranch or drumming up new business in town. Evangeline found herself learning skills she had never imagined needing: how to work the bellows, how to judge the heat of metal by its color, how to help shape iron into useful tools. But more than the technical skills, she was learning to work as part of a team again. Jeb had a way of making even the most difficult tasks seem manageable, and his steady optimism was infectious. When they ran into problems, and there were many, he would simply shrug and say, "Well, we'll figure it out." And somehow, they always did. 3 weeks into their partnership, they had their first real test. A wealthy rancher from the next county over had heard about their work and rode out to see if they could handle a large order: iron fittings for a new barn he was building. It was more work than they had ever taken on, but the pay would be substantial. "Can you handle it?" the rancher asked, looking skeptically at their small operation. Evangeline looked at Jeb, who gave her a slight nod. "Yes, sir," she said. "We can have everything ready in 2 weeks." After the rancher left, Evangeline felt a moment of panic. "Can we really do it?" she asked. Jeb was already calculating in his head. "It'll mean working from dawn to dusk, and we'll need to hire someone to help with the deliveries. But yes, we can do it." The next 2 weeks were the hardest of Evangeline's life. They worked 16-hour days, taking turns at the forge to keep it running almost continuously. Evangeline's hands became calloused and her back ached constantly, but she pushed through the pain. Every piece they completed brought them closer to their goal. The breakthrough came on a Sunday evening as they were tallying their earnings. Jeb had been keeping careful records of their income and expenses, and as he did the calculations, his eyes grew wide. "What is it?" Evangeline asked, seeing his expression. "If we can keep this pace for another week," he said slowly, "we'll have enough to make a substantial payment to the bank, maybe enough to negotiate a new payment schedule." Evangeline felt her heart stop. "Are you sure?" Jeb double-checked his figures. "I'm sure. We've done it, ma'am. We've actually done it." The next morning, Evangeline dressed in her best dress and made the trip to Millbrook alone. The bank was an imposing building at the center of town, and she had avoided it for months. Now she walked through its doors with her head held high and a leather pouch full of hard-earned money in her hands. The banker, Mr. Whitmore, was a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles who had always made Evangeline feel like she was asking for charity. Today, however, his expression was different as she placed the money on his desk. "This is quite a substantial payment, Mrs. Hartwell," he said, counting the bills with obvious surprise. "I must admit, I wasn't expecting this. I've started a smithing business," Evangeline replied simply. "I'm prepared to make regular payments on the same schedule going forward." Whitmore studied the money, then looked up at her with something that might have been respect. "Very well, we can draw up a new payment schedule. But understand, Mrs. Hartwell, this arrangement depends on your ability to continue making these payments." "I understand," Evangeline said, "and I can." As she walked out of the bank, Evangeline felt like she was floating. The ranch was still heavily mortgaged, and they would need to work hard to keep up with the payments. But for the first time in nearly a year, her home was secure. She found Jeb waiting anxiously by the wagon. When he saw her smile, his face lit up with joy. "We did it?" he asked. "We did it," she confirmed. That evening, they celebrated with a special dinner and sat on the porch watching the stars come out. The ranch was quiet around them, but it was a different kind of quiet now, peaceful rather than empty. "What happens now?" Jeb asked. Evangeline considered the question. "Now we keep working, build up the business, maybe get some cattle again someday, make this place what Thomas always dreamed it could be. And I can stay." The question was asked quietly, but Evangeline could hear the hope and fear in it. She reached over and took his hand. "Jeb, this is your home now, for as long as you want it to be. We're partners in this, remember?" The boy's smile was brighter than all the stars in the Wyoming sky. As the months passed, their business grew. Word spread throughout the territory about the quality of their work, and orders began coming in from ranchers and townspeople alike. They hired help when they needed it, and Evangeline found herself learning not just the technical aspects of smithing, but the business side as well. Jeb threw himself into the work with the enthusiasm of someone who had finally found his place in the world. He was growing taller and stronger, and Evangeline could see him becoming the kind of man his father would have been proud of. More importantly, he had brought life back to the ranch. The sound of the forge, the ring of hammer on anvil, the bustle of customers coming and going, all of it had transformed the empty, silent place into something vibrant and alive. One evening in late spring, as they sat on the porch after a particularly busy day, Evangeline reflected on how much had changed since that morning when a thin, determined boy had walked up her road asking for work. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked suddenly. Jeb looked at her with surprise. "Regret what?" "Coming here, tying yourself to this place, and my problems." Jeb was quiet for a long moment, and Evangeline worried that she had touched on something painful. But when he spoke, his voice was steady and sure. "Mum, before I came here, I was just surviving, getting by one day at a time, with no real purpose except to keep breathing. You gave me something to work for, something to build, this place, this business. It's not just yours anymore, it's ours, and I can't think of anywhere else I'd rather be." Evangeline felt tears prick her eyes. "You saved this place, Jeb, you." "Saved me? No, ma'am," he replied softly. "We saved each other." As the sun set over the Wyoming territory, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Evangeline Hartwell and Jeb Thornton sat in comfortable silence, watching their dreams take shape in the dying light. The ranch that had once been on the verge of bankruptcy was now thriving, its forges ringing with the sound of prosperity and hope. The drought had ended months ago, and green grass was already beginning to show in the pastures. Soon, Evangeline thought they might even be able to afford some cattle. The circle would finally be complete. But even if they never expanded beyond the smithy, she was content. She had learned that a home wasn't just a place, it was the people you shared it with, the work you did together, and the dreams you built side by side. In the distance, a meadowlark called from the grassland, its song carrying across the evening air like a promise of tomorrow. Evangeline smiled and closed her eyes, listening to the sound of hope itself. The widow rancher had indeed lost all hope, until one orphan knocked on her door and reminded her that sometimes salvation comes in the smallest packages, carrying the biggest hearts. Now that you've watched the full story, we'd really appreciate it if you could rate it out of 10 in the comments. Your thoughts help us improve and ensure we're bringing you the kind of storytelling you truly enjoy.